Hey guys, so today I know it's the middle of the week, but we're starting a new lesson, and this is day one of the new lesson, lesson 14.2. We're going to be talking about evidence of evolution, so different things that show that evolution has happened and stuff like that. Alright, so our focus question is, how does the fossil record, morphology and biochemistry, and adaptation provide evidence of evolution? So, I'm sure you all know what a fossil is. It's the remains or the outline of an organism that lived a long, long time ago. When an organism dies, it will eventually, not all the time, but some organisms, if they die in just the right place, the outline of their body will be left there for a long time for us to find. Morphology is actually like body parts. How do organisms' bodies change over time, and how can this be used to show evidence of evolution? And biochemistry. We can also find evolution when we're looking at DNA and proteins, because oftentimes DNA can mutate, which leads to changes in proteins. You guys, I know you already learned this in grade 8, but we're going to be going over it again at some point this week. Alright, so here are some new vocab words. I'm sure you've already heard some of these. So for example, you definitely know what fitness is because we just talked about it yesterday. So fitness is your ability to survive in and adapt to your environment. The more fit you are in your environment, the more likely it is that you're going to have more offspring. So future generations are going to look more like you. Another word you probably recognize, camouflage, hiding in plain sight, and an embryo, which is just a tiny little baby to be. All right, so these are the different things that we're going to talk about as evidence of evolution. Today we're only going to be talking about the fossil record, and throughout the week we're going to get through all of these. All right. So fossils show modern species resemble ancient species. So we can see, based on the fossil records, that there are fossils of organisms that look very similar to organisms that we have now. However, they were a little bit different. Like they were either really, really big or really small, or they had different body parts and different features on them. They also reveal that some species have changed very little over time. So if you look over here, this is the horseshoe crab. This is a horseshoe crab from approximately 150 million years ago. This is its fossil, and this is a horseshoe crab today. You can see that clearly it hasn't felt the need to evolve a whole lot, just because maybe it was very well suited to its environment a long time ago, and maybe it's still very well suited to its environment, still kind of looking the same. So we can see, based on the fossil records, that these are basically ancient organisms that have been on Earth for a long, long, long time, and not much has changed about them in that time. So the fossil record is an important source of information for determining the ancestry of organisms and the patterns of evolution. All right, so some organisms have not changed a lot over time, but some of them have. So studying the fossil records can actually be very important for us to see the transition from one organism to another. So if you look over here, this is called a glyptodon, and this is our modern day armadillo. They look pretty similar. There are some obvious body differences, but the basic idea is a glyptodon lived a long, long time ago, and it weighed about 2,000 kilograms. Our modern day armadillo is thought to be an ancestor of the glyptodon, which means that this was the original, and many, many, many millions of years later, we got our modern day armadillo. The modern day armadillo is a lot smaller. It's only about 4 kilograms, but you can see that this looks like this, so there's a good chance that they were actually related and that this is an ancestor of the glyptodon. All right, so this is actually something that Darwin found on his journeys on the HMS Beagle, and he wrote about it in his book, The Origin of Species. On the origin of species. All right, so another very important thing when looking in fossil records is finding transitional fossils. Now, you guys know that the word transition means to change from one thing to another, right? So a transitional fossil is basically just showing how organisms developed certain traits that we see a lot of today but were not common a long time ago. So if you look at this, the Archaeopteryx, it's thought to be one of the first birds ever to show up on Earth, and that's because it was one of the first organisms that we can find that have evolved feathers. Feathers did not exist before this bird actually showed up, so this is kind of a transition between a dinosaur, which is a reptile, to more bird-like creatures. And over the years, more and more organisms started to develop feathers as long as they were related to an organism that resembled this. This is called a transitional fossil because it shows a transition between dinosaurs towards birds, right? So, the new trait in this organism was feathers. Another example of a transitional fossil is this organism right here. A lot of scientists believe that animals and organisms began in the sea and somehow they found a way to crawl onto the land. So when they found this fossil, had these little arms, it showed that it was a very good possibility that it came out of the sea and crawled onto the land, right? This is a transitional fossil because it shows that an organism went from the ocean and began to live on land. Transition, right? Okay. Now, something you need to know when looking at any fossil, especially transitional fossils, are derived traits and ancestral traits. The word derived means that you somehow acquired this trait, right? So a derived trait is a newly evolved feature, such as feathers, that did not appear in the fossil records before this happened. So if I look over here, the derived trait might be these little arms, that this is new, no other fish had them, and this is what allowed this fish to crawl out of the ocean, and while all the other ones stayed inside. And this right here, its derived trait are its feathers. This is what distinguishes this organism from all other dinosaurs. All right, so those are derived traits. They are things that are new that later on we can find more and more and more of them in the fossil records. But before finding that organism, the transitional organism, this derived trait did not exist. An ancestral trait is something that's more primitive, meaning it's been around for a lot longer and a lot of organisms have had it, and you can see it in the fossil records for a long time. These are things like teeth, tails, and other features like that, or like claws. These are things that your ancestors had and they passed it on towards other generations, and they have been around for a long time. Derived traits are things that are new. All right. So now, guys, go to Nearpod and do the worksheet and then do the quiz. All right.